The water came down the Styking drainage on the 14th of August 2016. The way water comes when it has been building for 3 days behind soil that cannot hold any more of it. It moved through the valley at a pace that surprised people who thought they understood that country. It took out 2 culverts on County Road 7 before noon. By mid-afternoon, it had pushed into the lower pastures of 4 ranches along Cutter Creek and was still moving. The National Weather Service station at Libby, Montana, would record 3 inches of rain in 72 hours on top of a ground that was already saturated from a wet June and a wetter July. Not a record. Just enough. Every rancher along that drainage whose timber had been cut in the previous 8 years lost something in August of 2016. One lost a calving shed worth $14,000. 2 lost fencing they would not finish replacing until the following spring. One family lost 23 acres of bottomland hay ground to scour that will not fully recover for years, if it recovers. The water moved through their properties the way water moves through cleared land, fast, hard, and uninterrupted. One property it did not move through that way. One property, 638 acres at the upper end of the Cutter Creek drainage in Lincoln County, Montana, held its water the way a sponge holds it. The creek that ran through that ground rose 11 inches that August and then settled back. Nothing was lost. No fencing, no structures, no soil. The man who owned that property was named Earl Voss, and he had not done anything dramatic or clever or particularly expensive to achieve this outcome. He had simply declined to do what every one of his neighbors had done, for reasons that his neighbors had considered, at the time, to be either stubborn or foolish, or both. They don't say that anymore. If you grew up around people who held on to something when everyone else let go, land, timber, a way of doing things, and later watched them be proven right without ever saying, "I told you so," this channel was built for you. Subscribe and stay with us. Earl Voss was born in 1949 in Eureka, Montana, the county seat of Lincoln County, which sits in the northwestern corner of the state against the Idaho line and the edge of the Cabinet Mountains. Lincoln County is timber country. Has been since the first mills went up in the late 1800s, and the timber culture runs deep in the way of things that have shaped how people live and what they believe a piece of land is for. The mountains there are real mountains, not the gentle ridges of eastern Montana, but steep, heavily timbered slopes that hold snow into June and shed it fast when the temperatures swing. The creeks in that country run cold and clear in a normal year, and brown and hard in a bad one. Earl's father, Gus Voss, had run cattle on those 638 acres since 1961, when he bought the property from a family named Rediker, who had gotten it originally from a homestead patent that predated Montana statehood. Gus ran Black Angus, 80 to 90 head depending on the year, and he made his living quietly and without complaint, which is a description that fit his son equally well. Lincoln County runs about 3,600 square miles and fewer than 20,000 people, which works out to a population density that makes it easy for a man to go a week without speaking to anyone who isn't family. The economy has always been built on 3 things in roughly that order: timber, mining, and cattle. The timber came first and set the tone for the other 2. The idea that a piece of land is most useful when it is being actively stripped of something, and that the value of standing timber is lower than the value of timber at the mill. This is not a foolish idea. It is an idea that made Lincoln County livable for 100 years, and that has also, in the last 30, made parts of it harder to live in than it used to be. That is a thing that can be true on both ends simultaneously, and most people in Eureka understand that, even if they don't always say it that way. The Cutter Creek drainage runs roughly northeast to southwest for about 11 miles before it joins a larger tributary. The upper end of the drainage is steep and narrow, with slopes running at grades of 30 to 45% in places, the kind of terrain where water moves fast when it moves at all. A mile and a half below the Voss property, the valley floor widens and the creek enters a broader agricultural section where 6 ranches run bottomland hay and summer pasture. That is the section that flooded in August of 2016. That is the section where the calving shed went and the fencing went, and the 23 acres of hay ground scoured out to gravel. The people who farmed that section were not responsible for what the cleared hillsides above them had become. They were downstream from decisions made years earlier by neighbors they knew, in a market that was favorable at the time, under circumstances that seemed reasonable to everyone involved. The timber on the Voss place was not old growth by any technical definition. The upper ridge had been selectively logged once, in 1947, before Gus ever owned it. But the lower and mid-slope stands had grown back dense and undisturbed through the 1960s and 1970s, and by the time Earl took over the operation after Gus died in 1994, the timber on the property was substantial. Mature Douglas fir and western larch on the upper slopes, cottonwood and alder thick in the creek corridor, and a mixed understory of smaller conifers and brush that held the hillsides together in a way that a person who walked that ground could feel underfoot before they could name what they were feeling. In 1997, the timber market in Lincoln County was good. Not extraordinary, but good in the way that tends to make decisions look straightforward. A mill buyer named Don Kistler from a Kalispell operation came out to the Voss place in October of that year and walked the upper ridge with Earl for about an hour. He offered $74,000 for the harvestable timber on the upper 2/3 of the property. He said the logging would take 1 season. He'd use a cable system to minimize road disturbance, and he'd leave a 50-foot buffer on either side of the creek. That was the standard pitch. It was a reasonable offer. Several of Earl's neighbors had taken similar offers in the preceding 3 years, and their operations were not noticeably worse for it in the short run. Dave Ashton to the north had cleared 400 acres of his upper ground in 1995 and used the money to put up a new shop and pay off a note at the Eureka branch of Glacier Bank that had been bothering him since 1991. It was a rational decision. Most of them were. Earl walked Don Kistler back to his truck and thanked him for the time. He said he didn't think he was going to sell. Don Kistler asked if there was a number that worked better. Earl said it wasn't about the number. Don Kistler drove back to Kalispell without a contract. Earl has said, in the years since, that he isn't entirely sure he could have articulated at the time why he said no. He knew his land. He had spent 47 years walking it in every season and watching how it behaved in wet years and dry ones. He knew where the water came from on the upper ridge and where it went when there was too much of it. He knew that the 2 largest cottonwoods in the creek corridor, both of them over 4 feet through the trunk, both of them older than the homestead patent, had root systems that extended under the bank in a way that held the channel in place even in the years when the creek ran high. He knew all of this the way a man knows a piece of land he has worked since childhood, which is not always in language, and not always in terms he could write down. He just felt, looking at that ridge with Don Kistler standing beside him describing harvest blocks and cable corridors, that the trees were doing something he couldn't replace with a reforestation plan and a 50-foot buffer. That is not a sophisticated argument. It is not a technical one. Earl Voss has no degree in hydrology and has never attended a watershed management seminar. He is a rancher who paid attention for a long time, and the thing he paid attention to most was how his land behaved when it rained. He had been watching it since he was old enough to follow Gus around the property after a heavy storm which would have been 1957 or 1958 by his own reckoning. Gus walked the creek bank after every significant rain, checking the channel, looking at where the water had risen and how fast it had come back down, noting which pastures had standing water and which had drained cleanly. It was not a formal inspection. It was just the thing Gus did, and Earl did it alongside him until it became the thing Earl did, and then he did it alone after Gus was gone. He knew the upper ridge soaked rain slowly and released it slowly, even in the wet years, because the duff layer under the fir and larch was 8 to 12 inches deep in the places where the canopy was thickest, and the ground had been undisturbed for 20 or more years. He knew the creek came up fast in the cleared draw to the east, a section of county land that had been logged for a power line right-of-way in 1989, and he had watched that draw get faster every rain year since the cutting. He knew these things the way you know things you have watched for 50 years. Not from a report, just from watching. His father, Gus, had paid attention to the same thing, going further back. Gus had kept a weather log from 1963 until the year he died. Not a formal record, just a spiral notebook in the kitchen drawer where he wrote the rainfall total by month, the date the creek peaked, and a note if the creek did something unusual. There were entries from 1964, 1974, and 1981, where the note said something like, "Creek held fine," or "no trouble on the lower pasture even though other places had problems." Gus was not a scientific man. He was an observational one, which is a different thing and in some ways a more durable one. The 1974 entry was from the summer after Gus had cleared a small woodlot near the upper fence line to improve a pasture, the only timber removal he ever did on the property, and the creek had come up hard that August. He wrote, "Came up 3 feet. Don't know if the cutting had anything to do with it. Probably just rain." But he had replanted the woodlot by the following spring. Earl knew that entry. He'd read that notebook as a boy. When Don Kistler came back in the spring of 1998 with a revised offer, $81,500, with a modified harvest plan that excluded the creek corridor entirely, Earl thanked him again and declined again. He said it politely. Don Kistler, to his credit, did not push it past 2 visits. He went and bought timber from Dave Ashton instead. Dave had a second parcel up near 14 that was available, and the deal worked out for everyone involved, at least for the time being. The years between 1998 and 2010 were normal years in Lincoln County, as normal goes. The timber market rose, flattened, and thinned considerably after 2008, and several of the ranchers who had sold harvest rights in the late 1990s found that the money had gone in various useful directions while the ground itself had changed in ways they were only beginning to feel. Hillsides that had held together well under 40-year timber now ran faster after rain. A few creek channels that had been stable for decades began to migrate in wet springs, cutting into banks that had lost their root structure. Nothing catastrophic, just the slow, unremarkable arithmetic of land that has been changed and is adjusting to the change. Earl watched this with the quiet attention he applied to most things. He was not gloating. He doesn't gloat. He was noting. In June of 2012, the county extension agent for Lincoln County, a woman named Carla Britton, who had been in the position for 11 years and who knew that drainage about as well as anyone who hadn't grown up ranching it, drove out to the Voss place at Earl's request. He had called her because he had a question about the cottonwood stand in the lower creek corridor, where a section of mature trees had begun showing stress symptoms that he didn't recognize. Carla Britton spent an afternoon walking the property. She looked at the cottonwoods, which turned out to have a fungal issue that was manageable and not serious. But she also walked the upper ridge and the mid-slope timber and the hillside above the lower pasture, and she came back to the barn at the end of the afternoon and stood for a moment looking at the watershed above the place. She told Earl that his timber was doing something that most of the timber in that drainage was no longer doing. She used the word interception, which is the technical term for the way a forest canopy captures rainfall before it reaches the ground and slows the rate at which water enters the soil and eventually the creek. She said that on a steep drainage with the rainfall patterns of northwest Montana, the difference between a timbered hillside and a cleared one in terms of peak creek flow during a heavy rain event could be substantial. She said that his creek corridor cottonwoods and alders were functioning as what she called a riparian buffer. Root mass holding the bank, canopy slowing the flow, the whole system moderating what the creek did when it got big. She said she had not seen a riparian corridor that intact anywhere else in the Cutter Creek watershed. Earl asked her to write down the word interception so he could look it up. She wrote it on the back of a business card. He still has it, in the same kitchen drawer where his father kept the weather notebook. He is not certain he needed Carla Britton to tell him what he already understood in practical terms. He thinks she may have needed to hear herself say it out loud more than he needed to hear it. That may be unfair to Carla Britton, who was and is good at her job. But that is how Earl remembers the afternoon. The summer of 2016 arrived after 2 years that had been wetter than average across Lincoln County, and the July of that year was the third wettest July in Libby's 80-year weather record. The soil across the Cutter Creek drainage went into August effectively full. There was no more storage in the upper horizons. When the rain event hit on the 11th of August and ran through the 14th, the cleared hillsides moved their water into the creek almost immediately, the way a parking lot moves rain into a drain, because there was nothing left to hold it. The timbered hillside of the Voss place moved its water slowly, the canopy catching and releasing it, the duff layer absorbing what reached the ground, the root mass holding the soil that held the moisture in place until it could find its way to the creek over hours rather than minutes. The difference in peak flow timing between the Voss ground and the adjacent cleared properties, when the county road crew looked at it afterward, was estimated at somewhere between 4 and 7 hours. The water that came off the cleared hillsides hit Cutter Creek all at once. The water from the Voss place fed in slowly, over a longer period, at a lower peak volume. The creek through the Voss pasture rose 11 inches. The creek half a mile downstream, where it had gathered the runoff from 3 cleared properties above it, rose 4 feet, 2 inches, and moved out of its banks into the hay ground and the calving shed and the lower fencing that it would take the neighbors the better part of a year to replace. Earl drove the county road on the 15th of August to look at what had happened. He did not say anything to his neighbors about his timber, or about Don Kistler, or about the 1974 entry in Gus's weather notebook. He asked what needed doing, and he came back 2 days later with his tractor and a front-end loader and helped Dave Ashton push debris out of the channel below the ruined culvert. He worked for 2 days and didn't bring up his trees. Dave Ashton brought it up himself on the second afternoon, standing in the creek mud next to Earl's John Deere 5075E, with water still running brown behind them. He said, "I know why your place didn't go." Earl said, "Ground held the rain a little better up top, I think." Dave Ashton said he had sold his timber in '95 for $68,000 and used most of it to pay a banknote, and he didn't regret it. Exactly. He just wished he'd known what he was giving up alongside what he was getting. Earl said he didn't know either, not for certain. He said he just felt like the trees were working and he hadn't wanted to stop them. That's as close as he has ever come to an explanation. The Lincoln County Conservation District filed a summary report on the August 2016 flood event in the Cutter Creek watershed the following February. The report documented the rainfall totals, the creek stage data at 3 monitoring points, and the comparative outcomes across the 12 properties in the drainage. The Voss property was referenced, without being named, as an example of intact riparian and upslope timber function. The report noted that properties retaining greater than 60% of pre-1990 timber cover experienced significantly lower pasture impact during the event. It recommended that the county consider updated buffer requirements for future timber sales near critical drainage corridors. The recommendation has not yet been adopted as policy as of this telling. Carla Britton sent Earl a copy of the report in March of 2017 with a handwritten note that said only, "Thought you'd want to see this." He filed it in the same drawer where he keeps the weather notebooks. He did not send her a reply, which she says she expected and did not take personally. That is a fair characterization of Earl Voss in general. Dave Ashton, for his part, has been replanting selectively along the creek corridor on his property since the spring of 2017. He bought 600 cottonwood whips from a conservation nursery in Missoula and planted them by hand with his son over 2 weekends in April. They are not large trees yet. They will not be doing what mature cottonwoods do for another 10 or 15 years, minimum. Dave knows this. He planted them anyway. He told Earl what he was doing, and Earl said it sounded right. That was the extent of the conversation. 2 other ranchers in the drainage have done similar work on a smaller scale. A fourth, a man named Terry Bush, who runs a stocker operation on 320 acres on the west side of the creek, attended a riparian restoration workshop put on by the Extension Office in Libby in October of 2017. And afterward drove out to the Voss place, unannounced, on a Tuesday afternoon, to ask Earl if he could walk the Cottonwood corridor. Earl said yes. They walked it for about 40 minutes without saying very much. Terry Bush went home and ordered 200 alder seedlings from the same Missoula nursery Dave Ashton had used. He doesn't know if it will be enough. That is the honest answer most people in that drainage will give you if you ask what they've learned. Earl Voss is 74 years old now. He runs about 65 head of Black Angus on the same 638 acres, down from the 85 he was running 15 years ago, which is more a function of where he is in his life than of anything wrong with the ground. His son, a man named Curtis who works in Kalispell during the week and comes up most weekends, is beginning to take on more of the daily operation. Earl has shown Curtis the weather notebook, Gus's and his own, which he has been keeping since 1995 in the same spiral format, same kitchen drawer. He has shown him where the creek runs and where it wants to run when it has too much water, and which trees are doing the most work in the heaviest rain. He hasn't made a formal speech about any of it. That's not how it gets passed down in families like this. The timber on the upper ridge is old enough now that a mill buyer would find it considerably more interesting than Don Kistler did in 1997. Earl has received 2 inquiries in the past 4 years. He has declined both of them, politely, without much explanation. The cottonwoods in the creek corridor are larger than they were in 2012 when Carla Britton walked that ground. The 2 oldest ones, the ones with root systems that extend under the bank and hold the channel in place, are both still standing. Earl checks them every spring after the runoff, walking the bank with the deliberate pace of a man who has been doing this particular walk for 50 years and does not intend to stop. He does not know exactly what the property will do in the next big rain event. He knows what it did in 2016. He knows what the notebook says about 1974. He knows what the ground felt like under his boots when he walked it with Don Kistler in October of 1997, and understood, without quite being able to say it, that something was working, and he didn't want to stop it. Some knowledge doesn't announce itself. It just holds, quietly, until the water comes.